There had been no moment Raleigh Varrick had thought of more than this one. He stood staring at Jaken, the man he'd called a father for most of his life. He glanced around at the surrounding battlefield and his victims. Varrick supposed he should feel more than a small pain of seeing Benjamin Hayne dead. He could tell he was dead by the crumpled state of his body as his blood pooled in the snow, a dark contrast in the moonlight. Varrick, once he'd locked eyes with Jaken again, forgot about Byron, who lay helpless and sick. He drew his swords. He felt more exposed with the plate mail and fur he was wearing than with his longer jacket, an odd feeling to have at the moment. He narrowed his eyes at Jaken.
Complaining that you were my lapdog, only to run off to be another one's lapdog, isn't how I pictured you.
Varrick easily walked forward, unfazed by the jab.
Well, we both know what you wanted me to do. You sent me there.
It was an honest offer. If he'd succeeded, you could have had the life you wanted.
But you knew full well he couldn't heal what you did to me. You only thought about what it might cost him if he tried.
Varrick twirled both of his swords in his hands and attacked with a measure of caution.
I won't lie about that. The chance to aim you as my weapon one last time was considerably more appealing than just giving you up. If I could, I would have healed your curse myself. Of course, I'd have killed you afterward, because you'd just be another worthless human.
I never understood you, Father. Why blame an entire race for something a few people did?
They had their chances to make this right.
So blame people who were born after all this? They're still guilty?
They tried to commit genocide against us.
So we return it in kind?
What would you have me do,
I don't know. If I'd known that was your plan, instead of leaving, I would have tried to stop you.
That was the truth as Varrick knew it. When he'd come to Jaken for relief from the curse of his power, he didn't know how to tell him what had happened. Raleigh Varrick had only known Jaken as a ruthless soldier. Jaken was trapped by William Hayne's binding ability, yet it had done nothing to calm Jaken's drive to make the human race pay. Varrick knew he himself didn't have that drive. Jaken's simple release of him must have been because Jaken also knew Varrick lacked the drive for this mission. The sudden realization made him even angrier with his father. Their swords clashed easily. Neither of them was trying. Jaken had trained Varrick every morning for decades. Now that Varrick was back in his presence, the old familiar feel of this time as the man's bodyguard revisited him. His anger remained, but the sense of urgency for battle and vengeance was not there. Not for either of them. Varrick's mind snapped to attention suddenly after drifting into a dance of swords with his old master. The sound he knew well slashed through the air and announced the arrival of Tyrus Clade. Jaken immediately split his attentions between Varrick and the new arrival. On his back was Roan Astor. They landed next to Byron about 20 feet from the two men. They'd focused so much on their fighting that they had both forgotten about Byron. As Roan slid down the side of Tyrus's dragon form, Jaken, without saying a word, began walking over to the young man, stealing his prey.
No, you don't!
Varrick jabbed one of his short swords through the right side of Jaken's back. He watched the man fall forward, the weight of his body pulling him free of Varrick's blade. Varrick was frozen. He didn't actually think he would hurt his old master until now. Jaken looked up at his own face mirrored in the same surprise as his former ward.
You stabbed me!
I did.
Varrick's response was more confirming his own actions to himself than a response to Jaken's statement. Jaken reached up to take Byron's sword, which had slipped from his grasp when he fell wounded.
That isn't yours.
Jaken pulled his arm back as Varrick threatened another attack. Jaken's wound was nearly closed, but he would be weak for as long as a minute while the internal wounds healed. Varrick cursed himself as he picked up Byron's sword. If Varrick had known he would stab Jaken, he could have aimed for the heart. No such chance would appear now. Jaken knew better. Varrick tossed the sword toward Roan.
Here, Roan.
Landing expertly, the blade stabbed into the ground a few feet away from Roan, who stared incredulously at the action, then at the man who just performed it. Disbelief rendered Roan speechless, unable to quell the shock and fear coursing through him.
Go. Don't look back. Don't come back. If I live through this, I will find you and finish Phase 3.
Roan responded to the order with a silent nod. With one arm under the knees, the other under the back, he scooped up Byron's body. Tyrus got himself as low to the ground as he could, and Roan somehow managed to climb aboard the dragon form again, with Byron's unconscious form.
Let me know when you're ready.
What's about Ben?
We have to leave him. He's dead.
The words were surprisingly gentle in Roan's head, as if Tyrus had known this for a while. He sat Byron in front of him, wrapped one arm around Byron's waist and the other around the grip of flesh under the scale. He only hoped his one arm was strong enough to hold on for the short flight back to Fort William.
I'm ready. Fly carefully.
You got it.
They took off just as Jaken found his feet. He turned to face his son.
Oh, crap. You look pissed. Would you feel less mad if I said I was sorry?
Before Jaken could respond, Varek had thrown down his short swords and attacked Jaken hand to hand. It wasn't some moral stance on a fair fight, having stripped Jaken of Byron's sword. No, it was because fists were far more personal. Jaken didn't need a second example of his son's resolve. The wound in his side, though mostly healed, still ached and put him on the defensive against Varrick's blows. Varrick's training hadn't been wasted, as Jaken was finding out. While desperately trying to fend off the fists and kicks to stay upright. If Varrick got him to the ground, he was savage. Jaken remembered Varrick crushing a soldier's skull during one of their battles together before Jaken was imprisoned. He was not eager to experience that kind of rage firsthand.
So, if they're leaving you here, what do you plan to do?
Isn't it obvious? I'm here to delay you, giving them the time to rally and face you on their terms.
Both men, having reached a physical impasse, dropped their stances, opting to use their words as weapons against their opponent.
I never took you for the selfless sacrifice type.
I'm not.
Varrick held up a hand and slowly removed a glove to reveal the rotted flesh beneath it.
Yet, going out this way is a far better choice than sitting around waiting to rot to death.
Well, someone hasn't been feeding.
Varrick threw his fist at the man. Jaken caught it in his palm. After a brief pause of wordless eyeing, the two men were fighting once again. This time less disciplined and determined to defeat the other, expose a weakness, and kill. Varrick landed a left-right combination to Jaken's face that staggered him. Then, a kick to the left shin brought the man down to a knee. Varrick didn't pause despite the surprise of forcing Jaken to the ground. Instead, with his exposed hand, he reached down, grabbing hold of Jaken's neck, and felt Jaken's energy flow into him. He felt it wash through him like cool water on hot skin. Varrick was lost in the feeling of euphoria and who he was extracting it from. He noticed the energy quickly lost its punch after the first few seconds. Jaken was already in a weakened state before he got here.
Of course. You came here after creating all these twisted. You didn't wait.
Varrick had a sinister grin of pleasure.
Stop.
What's that?
Stop.
Stop who?
Varrick's mind awash with pleasure. Finally, his long-held feelings of helplessness, lack of direction, and need for vengeance was being assuaged by this stream of energy. Varrick was so focused on the gratifying moment that he never saw the man closing in on him from behind.
He was talking to me.
Varrick didn't have time to react as the hard blow struck him in the back of the head.
God damn. Did you have to wait so long?
I'm sorry, sir. I thought you had it well in hand.
Are you serious? He had me by the throat.
My view of the situation was poor. Again, I apologize, sir.
The man helped Jaken up. He was big and completely bald on his head and face. Jaken's men had found him a few months after he had released Varrick from his side. Jaken smiled to himself as he looked at Varrick, struggling to shake the pain from the blow to the head. Jaken bent down, carefully clasping the hand of his new bodyguard, who rescued him.
Meet your replacement. He's so much stronger than you. Darren, we're leaving.
Jaken weakly made his way to the puppeteer, who still sat where he'd tossed him down earlier. He was drained badly. If his bodyguard had waited a bit longer, Jaken wondered if he would have died. Could he in fact die that way? He wondered. He staggered slowly to where the puppeteer sat in the snow, still straining to control the remaining twisted humans.
Darren, get up. Snap out of it. The battle's over. We're leaving.
Varek had finally shaken loose from the pain in his head and made it back to his feet.
Ah, here he comes. The little princess. The name is Blowback, and the pleasure is yours.
Okay, first, no. Second, my father's code names are stupid.
This is Diana Corona, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Roan was desperate as Tyrus sat himself down inside the walls of Fort William. It wasn't because his arm was painfully numb from holding on as Tyrus flew here as fast and safely as he could. It was because he saw Byron's face covered in reddish veins. Roan couldn't rouse him at all. The last few minutes had been Roan realizing this was his fault. The short exchange with Helix had left Byron wounded, but it wasn't bad. Roan realized it as he collected the boy up in his arms. He felt the guilt tighten around his heart. If he hadn't been out there, Byron would have been able to handle it. Roan was certain of that.
Tyrus, you have to carry Byron. My arm's completely dead. You have to get him to Elizabeth.
When Tyrus didn't transform immediately, Roan groaned in frustration. He needed to find a way to climb off this version of Tyrus before he could go back to his human form and oblige Roan's recommendation. Swearing out loud, Roan was lost as to what to do. Luckily, a young soldier made his way by and Roan called to him for help. It took them a few moments to sort the means, but thankfully, Roan found a way down off Tyrus's back and onto the ground within a few minutes. Tyrus gathered Byron in his arms and carried him quietly as Roan followed. The helpful soldier from earlier returned to his original task. Fort William was in a state of full retreat. Roan and Tyrus waded through the scramble without consideration, with their focus being on Byron's welfare. Elizabeth was nearby in a helpless state, waiting for the last transport out to come take her along. Using her sense shockwave had weakened her, robbed her of her sight, and even made her nearly numb. If any enemy came through, they could kill her, and the only thing she would know is the slight sound of their steps. The anxiety was made worse by the fact that Roan was out with Tyrus doing God knows what. She had trust issues, and she knew that, but now was not the time to address them. She sat back on the cot, waiting, hoping something would end the silence she found herself surrounded by.
Elizabeth, we're coming in, and we need your help.
Who the hell is we?
Tyrus stepped through the small doorway of Elizabeth's private quarters.
He means me, sweetheart.
Elizabeth started to stand, but without her powers she felt herself waver. She gathered herself again, and this time she stood with some effort.
What's going on?
She couldn't hear well, but Elizabeth was aware of the strain in Tyrus's voice when he came in. She thought he might have been wounded.
It's Byron. He's been poisoned, I think.
Tyrus laid Byron on a cot on the opposite side of the room from Elizabeth.
I don't know how much help I'll be. Poisoned how?
By one of Jaken's shepherds, Helix.
Tyrus, take my hand.
Tyrus responded, taking her hand and guiding her to the cot where Byron laid.
I need you to put my right hand on his forehead and my left hand on his heart. Keep a firm grip. I can't feel anything.
Got it.
Can you help him?
I could possibly stabilize him, but we will need more help.
Tyrus placed her hands where she had requested, but was unsure of how much pressure he needed to exert. As if she'd heard the thought aloud, Elizabeth guided him.
As firm as you can. I don't know if my energy bursts hurt.
Tyrus felt a bit of apprehension.
I'm going to try and stop his powers to slow the poison.
Stop them? Won't that kill him?
If his body continues to use its accelerated healing to fight this, it will kill him.
When shepherds use their powers, it requires energy. By this I mean adrenaline, temperature, blood pressure. It all increases to produce this energy. Overuse can hurt, or even kill us. Our powers are not without risk.
We activate them like a muscle, but if we don't relax it, the increased state for our bodies will remain until we die. If his body is still trying to use his accelerated healing, then he is in danger of... There! I think I got it!
His breathing has increased. That's a good sign.
I'll stay here with him. Tyrus, you need to get ready. You'll have to fly him to Valenport to get him help from Dr. Isaac.
I'm pretty tired. I'll be able to go in a few hours. In the meantime...
Tyrus turned to face Roan, who stood behind him with a deeply concerned expression.
I need you to go and gather that battle harness. Remember it?
Battle harness?
The one that straps up my dragon form for combat purposes. It's designed for transporting soldiers. It should be in Mac's workshop.
Consider it done.
Make sure he knows what we're doing. He'll need to make alterations so we can secure Byron for flight.
Got it.
Tyrus was tired, and his body felt like rubber. It was almost all he could do to get himself into the other cot. Roan left and silence fell in Lisbeth's quarters. It took 20 minutes of sitting there in silence for Lisbeth to realize it was too quiet. She couldn't hear Byron's breathing at all. She panicked a little, but knowing that she was limited with her senses, Lisbeth didn't immediately call out. Instead, she got to the head of the cot and leaned close without feeling pressure on her ear. She was relieved when the sound of soft breaths entered her ear. Knowing Byron was okay, she considered her options. An idea entered Elizabeth's brain. She didn't hesitate as she stood, already running through the steps in her mind. After a few minutes, still numb, she placed her hands on what she thought was Byron's side nearest the wall. She rotated him to his side, pushing him against the wall, careful not to use too much force. Elizabeth then carefully slipped herself into the cot and positioned herself so that Byron's breathing went into her ear. She rotated her head a bit to an easier position, as Byron's breath was too intense on her ear. It reminded Elizabeth of when she was younger and this dog would always wake her in the orphanage. The only thing that was missing in this case was the overly wet nose. Elizabeth listened to his breathing with hawkish concentration, looking for any hint of danger.
This is R.C. Anthus, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Varek couldn't believe he'd been so stupid. Jaken had always insisted in every battle plan that they had a way out if things went bad. This meant that one of his better shepherds would cover their retreat. He took in the sight of Blowback. Varek was shocked by how short and stocky he was.
So, you're my replacement? I'll say this, you don't seem too impressive.
Blowback smiled.
I suppose not. But then, what does that say about you?
Varek and his enemy walked towards each other.
I'll be honest, I probably got that job because he raised me. It might not be fair to assume it had anything to do with my skills.
Fair enough.
The two men eyed each other for several moments. Varek finally broke their impasse with a punch. He was shocked when Blowback took the full brunt of the blow. His head whipped back, and with equal speed it returned to its original position with a smile across his face. Varek was shaken a bit by this, but threw two more punches at the man's midsection, then one at his face. Again, the man was only moved for a few seconds before he returned to a standing position, completely unfazed by the blows.
What the hell?
Blowback smiled and a short chuckle escaped him. Varek didn't like being toyed with. This time he threw as many blows as his body would allow. Blow after blow, punches, kicks. The short, stocky man didn't block any of them. It didn't matter the force either. Varek finally broke free of the trance of confusion and looked for another approach. He looked for his swords. They were stabbed into the ground somewhere. The momentary distraction caused Varek to miss the axe-handle blow that Blowback struck back with. The blow was so hard, all the air went out of Varek's lungs. A kick quickly followed with a punch to the face. The man's hands felt like stone to Varek, who tried to shake loose from the blue spots that swam across his eyes.
Earlier you insulted my name. Would you like to know what it means?
Varek couldn't answer as he gasped for air. He hadn't lost his footing, but that was only by sheer will.
My ability is to absorb any blow struck against me, and reflect it back at twice the strength. You couldn't hurt me if I gave you hours at the attempt.
Really? Are you certain?
Is that all you got?
Varek wasn't quite clear of the pain from the previous axe-handle blow, but he didn't have time to just stand around and wait for his brain to catch up to the situation. Instead, he unleashed as many blows as he could, and with as much force as he could get behind them. He threw punches until he couldn't feel his fists. He lashed out with kicks for as long as he felt he wouldn't fall down doing so. Varek must have landed some 50 blows all told, and this time he saw Blowback fall down. Instead of waiting to see what would happen next, Varek attempted to go for his swords once more. He dragged himself towards his swords, or at least what he thought were his swords.
Hey!
The shock of the shout made Varek turn around toward it, abandoning his task completely. He looked over at Blowback, who was still on the ground, still as a corpse. Then, Varek watched in horror as the man's top half sat up, and the head snapped to his direction.
Oh, come on. I just explained how this works, and you're all like...
Blowback mimicked Varek's shocked and tired face. Varek gave up hope and relaxed his body, surrendering to the pain he felt. Blowback stood up, carefully, and brushed the snow from his pants. He looked up at Varek as if shocked the man hadn't decided to run. The look on his face changed to one of approval, which struck Varek as a bit odd.
Well, this was certainly fun. You're stronger than I expected. But I shouldn't be too shocked about that. You were his bodyguard after all.
Varek's head fell to the snow as he resigned himself to his fate.
This game is over.
This is Arkneo Masato, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Tyrus Clade woke up in the dim light of Elizabeth's quarters. He wasn't sure if he'd overslept, but he felt refreshed enough for the journey to Valenport. He called out to her as he swung his feet over the side of his cot.
Elizabeth, it's time to get going. We have to...
He paused because of the strange sight in front of him. Elizabeth was on the cot with Byron lying, almost draped across her chest. Dumbfounded, Tyrus waited a few moments to find the words and spoke, full-throated this time.
Elizabeth, we have to get moving.
The first thought Elizabeth had when she woke was terror. She had fallen asleep. Byron could be in danger. This was quickly alleviated by the air against her neck. Then came the second fear. Tyrus had woken her up and seen her like this. A blush quickly infused her face with a red hue that made her cheeks hurt.
Well, I wasn't expecting to see that. Mind explaining?
I do actually. I don't have time.
She started to get up. She found she had some feeling back in her body, and this caused another embarrassment as she realized Byron had a hand on one of her breasts. Normally she might have felt violated, but she didn't linger on it too long.
Well, that's a hell of a way to find out your numbness is subsiding.
She said this to no one in particular as she picked up Byron's arm and set it back over on his own side. She noticed how clammy and cold his hand was when she did it.
Gross. He'll need some water before we leave. He'll also need to be wrapped up in whatever skins and blankets we can spare. He won't survive the trip otherwise.
It was nearly an hour before everything was set. Roan had bundled Byron up in skins and a couple body blankets until nothing but his face was exposed from his eyebrows to his bottom lip. He looked like a baby. Roan reached over to a large mug with a sponge and soaked up some water, and brought it to Byron's lips. Roan's guilt over Byron's condition had only increased.
Don't die. I can't handle losing another brother.
The words didn't relieve him in any fashion. He focused on the still face as he let the sponge drip water into Byron's mouth. He was careful only to let it drip as Elizabeth had instructed. Mac and Tyrus worked together to set up just outside the hall where Roan and Byron stayed. Elizabeth was sitting at one of the tables, still looking weary. Roan hadn't slept either, but he knew he could still sleep on the last cart to Valenport. It'd be 3 weeks of hard travel, and he wouldn't know about Byron's fate once the prince left here. Every moment until they parted ways, Roan intended to be there for Byron. Fort William was too quiet. Roan had never heard it this quiet since he'd come here. There were some of maybe a dozen people left now within the walls of a fort designed to hold at least 500 people, and as much as 1,000 in a time of war. Mac opened the door. Roan looked at Byron, thinking the boy might be disturbed by the loud creak of the door. There wasn't even the slightest hint that Byron had heard it. Roan sighed.
Come! It's time for you to get going.
Mac made his way into the room and helped Roan carry Byron out to where Tyrus was now transformed and strapped up with the battle harness. It was impressive that Mac had been able to come up with it from such a rough idea Tyrus had had.
You climb up on there, and I'll lift the lad up to you.
Mac directed Roan to bring his end of Byron's wrapped-up form to the side so he could gather him properly.
Are you sure you got it?
Roan knew it was a stupid question, since Mac was already holding Byron easily in his arms.
Shut your cackle! I can lift this wee little lad. Right, sorry.
Using a set of steps, Roan easily climbed up onto Tyrus's back, which had been much easier than getting Byron up there from the battlefield. When Roan reached the top, he saw the belt and hard leather board that was meant to secure Byron.
Someone needs to go with him.
It's already been decided that Elizabeth will go.
Roan didn't respond. Instead, he reached out, pulling Byron from Mac's outstretched arms. Roan secured Byron in place, making sure his buckles were firm, but not dangerously tight. Looking at Byron's face again, he saw the small pinkish veins conveying the boy's illness to him once again, as if he needed it. He felt the oddest compulsion just then and placed a small kiss on the prince's cheek.
Don't die.
Byron gave no response. After hoisting Lisbeth up onto Tyrus's back and helping her strap in, Roan sent them on their way. He couldn't delay it any longer. When they were finally away, he turned to Mac, who stood next to him.
So you're really staying? I can't leave my shop. It's all I've known for 25 years. If I'm to die, I'd rather die here in this place where I had purpose.
Roan hugged him without a word of protest. He understood why Mac had to do this. He didn't like it, but he felt that were the situation reversed, he would do the same.
Lad, don't worry about me. I will. Take care.
Roan didn't have anything worth taking with him. He'd saved most of his money for when he and his twin brother Sanny could step down from their commissions as soldiers and buy land. The only thing he had was a bag of money, a few clothes, and his weapons and armor. He settled into the long cart. He watched as the life he'd known for the last 8 years grew smaller and smaller until he could see nothing but the edge of the inner wall to Fort William. Roan was headed to uncertainty for the first time since he'd arrived there as a newly orphaned 10-year-old. He felt just as helpless as he had then. The cart's creaking wood offered no refuge from his heavy thoughts.
This is writer-director Joshua Kisberg, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Byron was relaxed. Somehow he'd woken up in a warm bath. It wasn't as hot as he liked, but he found it pleasant enough. He was slightly confused. He was sure he remembered being in a battle, but he couldn't remember anything about it. He tried to throw the thought away and relax, but he couldn't. The more Byron tried to forget about it, the more it pushed into his mind. Then suddenly, a figure stood before him in the bath. No sound made. The figure was just there. Byron had a bad feeling that he was in trouble and made an attempt to stand.
How did you get...
Byron didn't have a chance to finish as the man forced his hands around Byron's neck, forcing his head beneath the water. Fear had Byron violently thrashing about, desperately grabbing at the man's hands and wrists. But the assault had been so sudden, there was little extra air left in Byron's body to mount a defense. His eyes blurry from the water, Byron couldn't identify his attacker. He attempted to use his powers, but to no avail. Byron felt the lack of oxygen burning in his lungs, which caused him to lurch with the need to breathe, but the fear of knowing what that meant stopped him. He was drowning. Suddenly, he felt his mind take over. Byron still couldn't see his attacker clearly, but he had a suspect in mind. Jaken. Byron mounted one last attempt to fight, but even as he did, he knew it was pointless. He took a breath. The pain was sharp, brutal, but it only lasted for a few seconds. Then, Byron felt his eyelids closing. The hands released his neck, but it was too late. He was already dead. Somewhere off in the distance, he heard someone scream.
Tyrus, you have to sit down now!
Tyrus's calm voice broke through Lisbeth's frightened mind.
What's wrong?
It's Byron! He's not breathing!